Hey everyone, I just wanted to make a few comments about the questions of race, ethnicity, and nation, and some of these sorts of concepts that really have very fuzzy edges to them. It seems to me. I was noticing in the comments, that people were when they're thinking about who is African, it's not a hard, it's not an easy thing to pin down, is it? I mean, you know. We might suppose that it's simply those people who were born on the African continent. But it's not as straightforward as that. I mean, the African diaspora may well want to be identified with the continent. They, in many cases, were taken from there forcibly by slavery and things of that nature. Sometimes it was immigration that was under less than great circumstances, and so, I think simply saying whoever's born there automatically is African is problematic, and it's problematic for a second reason. I mean, there are some people who are born there who are part of a kind of colonizing or settling sort of group, and their people may have been there for hundreds of years in some cases, and yet, there is for some people certainly a kind of sense that being African in a certain way, means understanding something about the continent itself. Now, those who are part of a colonizing or settling group may well understand that. They may well, right? They may not. I mean, we have the history of apartheid, which was a history of subjugation of South Africans, for example. And so we have a whole group of people who, in a certain sense, it could be argued, never really understood what it meant to be African. Rather, they wanted to make Africa into something else, make Africa into Europe or something like that. Well, it's really interesting to think about race as a category in relation to other categories. I mean, we sometimes think that we have a pretty clear idea of what it means. Race is, something that we see in the world. If you've done any studying on this at all, you realize that there is no genetic basis for race at all. There's nothing in the genome, in anyone's DNA that is an indicator for race. Having said that, there is certainly the experience of race within society. People are identified as being parts of races, but it's not always a stable thing. You can go to different places and be identified in different ways. I mean, some Africans, I've heard several Africans recount the experience of coming to the U.S. and only realizing that they were black once they came to the U.S., right? I mean, it was never an issue back in Nigeria or Kenya or wherever it is they were from. And then as soon as they get to the U.S., there's now a category. There's a thing called black, right? We might think, living in the U.S., well, that's crazy. I mean, how is that even possible? But I assure you, it is possible, right? And so, there's this sense that, race is not a very clear category. There was a time in the 19th century when people thought we could, scientifically recognize and designate races. They were somehow hardwired into reality. That was a 19th century and early 20th century idea, and I think virtually everyone has given up that notion that there is something out there in the world that somehow corresponds to race in any sort of biological or genetic sense. Socially, as I said, absolutely it's there. But if it's a social issue, if it's a social category, we also have to think about other social categories that might that might also kind of serve to divide us up, serve to sort us out, if you wish. So ethnicity is an obvious one. I mean, when I talk about groups within Africa, a lot of people, including Africans, will sometimes use the word tribe. I don't use the word tribe generally, and part of the reason for that is that there's a history of using that word as if it is a kind of designator of primitive people, right? So if you're talking about tribes, they're very traditional and in many cases sort of primitive sorts of groups. Well, we don't use the word generally in European societies or in North American societies except for Native Americans, right? And so when we use the word tribe, often it stands in for some sort of primitive grouping. Well, I want to just try and avoid that as much as possible. I mean, I'm not sure that primitive and non-primitive sort of divider really is all that informative. And it should be said, most anthropologists don't think it's all that informative either. So I tend to use the word ethnicity, right? So if we're talking about groups within, let's say, Kenya, there are several large groups within Kenya. There are Kikuyu, there are Luo, there are Luya, there are many others. And I think of these as ethnicities. They're ethnic groupings in the same way as the Welsh would be, or it's the Scottish, or as other groups of that sort. So, if we're going to talk about these sorts of groupings of humans that have shared characteristics to them and shared histories, I think ethnicity often does the job for us. Having said that, we're going to talk later in the term about things like the Rwandan genocide. And what's really interesting in that case is that there is a sense that there's a racialization of people within that set of events, right? I'm not going to go through the whole thing now because I have another video on that. But what you can see there is something which people from the outside might simply think of as differences of ethnicity, differences of groupings between various African groups, gets cashed out as racial differences, right, between Hutus and Tutsis. And it should be said that those racial differences arguably very much came from European categories. I mean, when Europe was dividing up Rwanda, Belgium in particular, they were looking at it as there are two groups here, and one of them it looks more European. The Tutsis look more European, and so they were given a certain amount of power. There was a kind of indirect rule that the Belgians and later the French engaged in, and so it divided the people between them, and it essentially racialized the people. And so what you get is a Rwandan genocide eventually, which was essentially a racial genocide, even though from the North American vantage point it was one African group against another. And so you've got these kind of sliding categories. Sometimes we think of them as ethnicities. Sometimes we think of them as racializations. We can think of terms like nation, right? And so nation is, we think of that as a kind of political grouping often. But the fact is, it's not necessarily that. I mean, it may well be a kind of designation of people that have a shared history and a shared family structure and so forth. We may think of words like kingdom, right? And that might seem like a political structure, but usually those have a kind of ethnic kind of root to them. We think of society, right? And those don't necessarily have ethnic ties at all. We have out of the 19th century people talking about societies that are based on common historical, traditional, shared aspects to them, and then societies that are essentially societies of agreement. So societies in which people just decide to associate with each other for a specific purpose. So those are more like businesses. Community, family, population. There's an interesting one, right? I mean, population is a notion which in which that's a more common contemporary notion in which we think about ways in which we can group people based on particular kinds of shared characteristics, but not necessarily the way race would do it. And so a shared characteristic might be, let's say, a predisposition towards a particular disease, or a predisposition towards some physical attribute. And where does that come from? Well, it comes from often a shared geography, often a shared set of circumstances that have influenced evolutionary paths. So we talk about populations in that sense, and so we use the sort of notion in, for example, epidemiology, where we look at differences in susceptibility to illnesses and so forth. We've got a lot of different kinds of categories that really slide between each other. And, to the extent that we think that race is a very kind of specific and isolated category in and of itself, we're not actually taking into account the history of how we've actually regarded these things. People, can go from having a kind of racialized difference to being a non-racialized difference. There was a time, for example, in Europe, that the Irish were a different race. Right? They were a different race. And in fact, not only a different race, but even sometimes in the popular imagination, a different species. If you look at some of the drawings in magazines from the 18th and 19th century, you see Irish people depicted as monkeys, right? Just the very same way that the racialized depictions of Africans would be. And so you get this notion of a kind of slide between the ways that we group people, and the more you want to denigrate, the more you want to put down another group, the more you slide them into something that's further and further away from you. If it's just a matter, for example, of ethnicity, well, we all have ethnicities, right? There's yours, there's mine, whatever. That's a pretty neutral category for the most part, even though you can have quite sharp battles between them. But as soon as you start getting to race, and even more so species, you end up getting into something where you're pushing one group further and further away, making them more and more what we say is other. Okay, and those others are no longer people that you have to regard as equal, that you have to give any real consideration to. They're easier to put down, they're easier to control, they're easier to rule, they're easier to enslave. And so when we think about, what makes somebody African, we talked about this elsewhere. I talked about this elsewhere in other videos, but, this notion of the slide between race, ethnicity, nation, family, population, species, all of these sorts of things really, I think, are really interesting kind of ways that we slide back and forth. And these things differ at different times. There's nothing really hardwired into nature about most of them. And so that's, I think, a really interesting kind of feature of the way that we sort the world out. And it should give us all a little bit of pause when we're thinking about how we sort the world out. Is it really something that exists in the world out there, or is it something that we're making up for some useful purpose to us, to our group, to people that we care about, all of that sort of thing? Is there a way that we're sorting the world out into who is like us and who is not like us? So that's something to consider, on all the issues around race and related issues. All right, thanks.